get back on that train. That's what William Carter told himself the whole ride to the station. Tell her to leave. Tell her she made a mistake. Tell her this place will break her. But when the train stopped and she stepped onto that platform, eyes red, clutching a battered suitcase like it was the last thing she owned in the world, William Carter forgot every word he'd planned to say. And then Victor Blackwood opened his mouth, and everything changed. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. William Carter had not been to the Dust Creek train station in 4 years. The last time he'd stood on that platform, he'd been watching a casket get loaded onto a freight car. A pine box. Simple. No flowers because he'd forgotten to bring any. Just a box carrying the woman he was supposed to marry going back east to be buried with her family, while he stood there in the November cold without his hat because he'd taken it off and somehow never put it back on. He'd driven home that evening through a blizzard, and somewhere along the way, he'd made a decision. He would not love anyone again. It wasn't grief talking. It wasn't a man broken by loss making a desperate promise to the dark. It was a calculation cold and simple as a balance sheet. Love cost too much. The kind of cost that didn't show up in any ledger, the kind that hollowed a man out and left him standing hatless in the snow, unable to remember why he should go inside. He'd been fine with that decision for 4 years. He'd run the ranch, fed the cattle, fixed the fences, paid his bills, most of them anyway. He'd been fine. And then his sister Margaret had written him a letter. He'd read the letter 3 times standing in the kitchen, and each time he got more angry. "I've found someone for you, William. Her name is Charlotte Hayes. She's from Philadelphia. She answered an advertisement, one of those mail-order arrangements. Before you throw this letter in the fire, just listen. She's not what you think. She's had a hard time of it. She needs a fresh start. And you, brother, need to stop living like a man who's already buried. She arrives on the November 14th train. Please be there." He'd thrown the letter in the fire. Then he'd stood there watching it burn and thought about what Margaret had said. You need to stop living like a man who's already buried. His sister had always had a talent for saying the thing he didn't want to hear. He still didn't want to hear it. But the letter kept burning, and the words stayed with him. And on the morning of November 14th, William Carter hitched up his horse, pulled on his coat, and drove to the Dust Creek train station, not to welcome anyone, but to send someone away before she made a terrible mistake. He was going to be kind about it. He was going to be respectful. He was going to tell this Charlotte Hayes gently that there had been a misunderstanding, that the ranch was struggling, that he was not in a position to take a wife, that she deserved better than a man who had nothing left to give her. He had the whole speech planned. He never got to give it. The station was busy that morning, which surprised him. Dust Creek was not a busy town. It had a saloon, a general store, a bank that was slowly draining his account, a church he hadn't been inside in years, and about 400 people who mostly kept to themselves. On a regular Tuesday morning, you might see a dozen people on the main street. But today there was a crowd at the station, and it took William a moment to understand why. Victor Blackwood was there. Victor Blackwood was always somewhere, it seemed. The man owned half the land between Dust Creek and the Wyoming border, ran 3,000 head of cattle, and had the county sheriff in his pocket like a pocket watch. He was 60 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a white hat that he kept clean in a way that struck most working ranchers as vaguely offensive. He didn't wear a hat like a man who worked in the sun. He wore it like a crown. Victor was standing on the platform with 2 of his ranch hands watching the train pull in with the satisfied expression of a man who owned everything he could see and was thinking about buying the rest. William tied his horse and made his way through the small crowd. He spotted a few merchants, the postmaster, a couple of ranch wives who'd come to collect packages. Normal enough. But there was a tension in the crowd he couldn't quite place, the kind of tension that comes when people are waiting for something to happen and not entirely sure they want to see it. The train hissed and groaned to a stop. Doors opened. Passengers began stepping down. William positioned himself near the far end of the platform, away from Victor, away from the crowd. He'd spot her when she came out, Margaret had written that Charlotte had yellow hair and would be carrying a brown suitcase, and he'd approach her quietly, walk her somewhere private, explain the situation, and make sure she had enough money to buy a return ticket. He'd already tucked $10 in his coat pocket for exactly that purpose. It was more than he could afford, but it was the right thing to do. He watched the doors. He waited. And then she stepped off the train. The first thing he noticed was the suitcase. Brown leather, one of the clasps broken, held shut with a length of rope someone had tied in a careful sailor's knot. It was not a large suitcase. It was, in fact, a very small suitcase for a person moving 1,000 miles to start a new life. And that smallness said something William couldn't quite name yet, but felt somewhere low in his chest. The second thing he noticed was that she'd been crying. Not recently, not in the last few minutes, but recently enough that her eyes were still pink at the rims, still carrying that particular fragility that comes after someone has cried for a long time and then very firmly decided to stop. She was holding herself carefully the way people do when they're not sure they're finished. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 26, yellow hair pinned back under a hat that had seen better days. A gray traveling coat that was clean but thin, too thin for a Wyoming November. William noted with a rancher's automatic assessment of things that might cause problems. She stood very still for a moment at the bottom of the train steps, and she looked at Dust Creek, the way a person looks at a thing they've been imagining for a long time and are now deciding whether the reality measures up. Her chin was up. That was the thing William noticed third, and it was the thing that stopped his speech cold before he'd even started walking toward her. Her chin was up. Not defiantly, not performatively, just up, like she had decided somewhere between stepping off that train and touching her feet to the platform that she was going to face whatever came next with her face forward. Whatever she'd been crying about on the train, and he could tell it had been considerable, she had packed it away somewhere and closed the lid. William took 2 steps toward her, and Victor Blackwood started laughing. It wasn't a quiet laugh. Victor Blackwood didn't do anything quietly. It rolled out of him like something he'd been holding for the purpose loud enough to turn heads shaped for an audience. "Well, look at that," Victor said loudly enough that half the platform heard him. Carter finally sent away for himself a wife. He looked at his ranch hands, then back at Charlotte, his eyes moving over her the way a man looks at livestock he's considering purchasing and finding substandard. A city girl. In those shoes. He shook his head with theatrical pity. "Lord have mercy, sweetheart. You have any idea where you are?" Charlotte had gone very still. "You're in Dust Creek, Wyoming." Victor continued walking a few steps closer, unhurried, enjoying himself. "Population 400 and however many cattle. We get hard winters here. Real hard. The kind that kills things that aren't built for it." He glanced at her coat. "That what you're planning to wear?" A few people in the crowd made sounds, half laughter, half discomfort. The postmaster looked at his shoes. One of the ranch wives pressed her lips together, but didn't speak. William had stopped walking. He was standing about 15 feet away, and he was watching Charlotte Hayes, and he was feeling something he hadn't expected to feel, which was anger. Not his usual anger, the low, tired, distant kind that came with bank notices and bad weather, and the accumulated frustrations of a man who'd been fighting alone too long. This was sharper than that. Newer. I didn't move yet, though. He waited. Because something about the way Charlotte had gone still made him think she was not done. He was right. Charlotte turned her head and looked at Victor Blackwood. She looked at him for a long moment with those pink-rimmed eyes, and then she said in a voice that was quieter than Victor's and somehow carried further, "I've heard Wyoming winters are hard." Victor tilted his head. "That right?" "Yes." She adjusted the rope handle of her suitcase. "I've also heard that the men here are proud of how hard everything is, like it proves something about them." A pause, brief, precise, the pause of someone choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "Does it?" The platform went quiet. Victor's smile didn't disappear exactly, but it changed shape. The amusement went out of it, and something else came in, something that had teeth. "You've got a mouth on you," he said. "I've been told that," Charlotte said, "usually by men who expected silence." Victor stared at her, Then he looked at William, and his expression carried a message William had received from Victor Blackwood, before a message that said, "This isn't finished, and remember who you're dealing with, and this will cost you." Then Victor turned and walked away, his ranch hands following, and the crowd began to breathe again. William stood still for another moment. Then he walked up to Charlotte Hayes. She heard him coming and turned to face him, and he saw her jaw tighten slightly. Not much, just a small gathering of muscle that said she was bracing for something. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the $10 in his coat pocket felt suddenly very heavy. "You're William Carter," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Your sister wrote me about you." "I know." A short silence. She looked at him steadily. He looked at the broken clasp on her suitcase, and then back at her face. "She said you were stubborn," Charlotte said. "She's right. She also said you were honest." "I try to be." Charlotte nodded slowly. "Then be honest with me right now, before anything else. Just be honest." William looked at her for a moment. The platform had mostly cleared. The train was already pulling away behind her, which struck him as slightly symbolic, in a way he didn't have the vocabulary for. She stood there in her thin coat with her small suitcase and her chin up, and she asked him to be honest. He took a breath. "The ranch is in trouble," he said. "I owe the bank money I don't have. It's been a bad couple years. The house it's a working ranch house. It's not comfortable. The winters here will test you. I have nothing to offer a woman except hard work and cold mornings and a life that is nothing like Philadelphia." He paused. "And I don't," he said more quietly, "believe in this. What we're supposed to be doing. I think it's wrong for both of us, and I think we'd both end up miserable, and I think the honest thing is to say that right now, before either of us makes a mistake, we can't undo." He reached into his coat pocket and held out the $10. "There's enough here for a ticket back east," he said. "Or to Denver, or wherever you want to go. I'm sorry you came all this way. That was my sister's doing, not mine, and you shouldn't have to pay for it." Charlotte looked at the money. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up at him. "Are you finished?" she said. He blinked. "Ma'am." "With your speech. Are you finished?" Yes." "Good." She reached out and gently pushed his hand, the one holding the money, back toward him. "Put that away, Mr. Carter. I'm not going back to Philadelphia." "Miss Hayes, my father died 3 months ago," she said. The words were quiet and even, and cost her something he could hear it, the way you can hear the weight in a sentence, even when the voice carrying it doesn't shake. "We had a house. We had a business. After he died, I found out how much he owed. The house went first. Then everything else. I sold what I could and paid what I could, and then there was nothing left." She paused. "I didn't come here because I wanted a comfortable life, Mr. Carter. I came because I needed a place to work. And from what your sister tells me, you need someone who knows how to work." William said nothing. "I understand if you don't want me here," Charlotte continued. "I understand that this was your sister's idea and not yours, and you're a private man, and you didn't ask for this. I understand all of that." She met his eyes directly. "But I'm not going home. There is no home to go to. So if you're going to send me away, you need to tell me somewhere to go, because I'm not getting back on that train with no destination." The $10 was still in William's hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. He put the money back in his pocket. They rode back to Carter Ranch in almost complete silence, which suited William fine, and seemed to suit Charlotte fine also. She sat beside him on the wagon bench with her suitcase on her lap. It was too small for the cargo area somehow, or maybe she just wanted to hold on to it, and she looked at the land as they drove through it. He found himself watching her look at it. He knew this land the way he knew the lines of his own hands. He knew where it was good and where it was struggling. He knew the stretch of creek that ran low in August. He knew the north pasture that caught too much wind in winter. He knew the places where the soil was rich and the places where it had given up on being rich and settled into being just enough to get by on. He wondered what she saw. She didn't ask questions. He'd expected questions. He'd prepared himself for questions, practical ones about the house, about the work, about what she was supposed to do. But she just looked at the land with those careful eyes, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking, and for some reason that bothered him more than questions would have. When they pulled up to the house, Charlotte climbed down from the wagon before he could help her and stood in front of it and looked at it. The same way she'd looked at everything else carefully, completely without much expression. The house was it was honest like he'd said. 2 stories, timber-framed, weathered to a particular shade of gray that had nothing to do with paint. The porch railing had been broken for 2 years, and he hadn't gotten around to fixing it. The garden beds on the south side were bare and weedy. "The bedroom upstairs on the east side is yours," William said, climbing down. "The door latches. I'll knock before I come up." He paused. "I want to be clear about that." Charlotte looked at him. Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but something warmer than what had been there. "All right," she said simply. "I'll show you where things are in the kitchen. Mornings I'm up before 5. You don't have to be." "I'll be up before 5, she said. "Miss Hayes." "Charlotte," she said. "Please." He stopped. "Charlotte," he said, and the word felt strange in his mouth, like something he'd forgotten how to do. "You don't have to prove anything to me on the first day." She picked up her suitcase. "I know," she said. "I'm proving it to myself." She walked past him toward the front door. At the threshold she stopped and turned back. "Mr. Carter." "William," he said because it seemed fair. "William." She said it the way he'd said her name, carefully, like something being picked up for the first time. "That man at the station, Victor Blackwood, who is he?" The shift in William's expression was small, but she caught it. "He owns most of the land between here and the county line," William said. "Runs cattle, has money, has power." A pause. "Doesn't like me much." "Why not?" "He's made offers on my land before. I've turned them down." He held her gaze. "He doesn't like being told no." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "He looked at me like he already knew something about me," she said. "Something I didn't know he knew." William had noticed the same thing and hadn't let himself think about what it meant. "You're probably imagining it," he said. He didn't believe that, but he said it because the other option was a conversation he wasn't ready to have. Charlotte looked at him for a moment with those careful eyes. Then she nodded and went inside. The first week was strange. Not bad, just strange. Like living with the awareness of another person after years of being alone. The way a silence can suddenly feel different when someone else is sitting in it with you. William did not know what he had expected. Maybe incompetence, a city woman who didn't know which end of a broom to use, who burned coffee and asked foolish questions and needed to be managed. Maybe resentment, a woman who'd arrived at a hard situation and was quietly furious about it. Maybe fragility, the kind that announces itself in small ways, in flinching at work, in needing reassurance, in making a man feel like a caretaker. Charlotte was none of those things. She was up before 5 every morning, as she'd said. Not loudly, she didn't bang around the kitchen or announce her presence. She was simply there when he came downstairs, a cup of coffee, already made, the fire already going, the kitchen already smelling like something organized. She cooked plainly and well. She cleaned without being asked. She found the root cellar on her own, inventoried it without comment, and appeared at supper that evening with a piece of paper showing him what was there and what they needed before winter. "You're low on salt pork," she said, setting the paper beside his plate. "And you'll want more flour than this. I can stretch what's here, but if we have a bad storm early." "I know," he said, because he did know. He just hadn't written it down because writing it down made it more real. She nodded and didn't push. Just moved on to the next thing, the same way she did everything, steady forward, without complaint. On the third day he came in at noon and found her in the barn. Not just in the barn. In the far stall where he kept a heifer who'd been off her feed for 2 weeks, crouched down beside the animal with her city coat replaced by one of his old work jackets and her hair pinned back under a kerchief, and she was talking to the animal quietly while she examined its leg. William stopped in the barn doorway. "She's got a stone in her hoof," Charlotte said without looking up. "Has she been limping?" "A little," he said slowly. "I thought she'd work it out." "She won't work it out. She'll get worse." Charlotte glanced up at him over her shoulder. "Do you have hoof picks?" "In the cabinet near the door." He got the hoof picks. He came and crouched beside her, and they worked together to get the stone out, Charlotte holding the leg, William working the pick. The heifer was nervous and difficult, and Charlotte talked to her the whole time in a low, steady voice, and by the end, the animal had settled enough to let them finish. When it was done, Charlotte sat back on her heels and stroked the heifer's side. "She'll be all right," she said. "She'll need a few days." "How do you know about cattle?" William asked. He hadn't meant it to come out the way it did, not suspicious exactly, but surprised in a way that had an edge to it. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "My uncle had a farm," she said, "outside the city. We spent summers there when I was small." She paused. "Before things changed." He waited in case there was more. There wasn't. "Thank you," he said instead. She looked at him. "It's your heifer, William. You don't have to thank me." "I know," he said. "I'm thanking you anyway." Something passed across her face. Brief, complicated, too quick to read. Then she stood up and dusted off her knees and went back to the house, and William stayed in the barn for a while with the heifer, thinking about the way she'd said before things changed, and what kind of changing she meant, and why it felt like something he recognized. By the end of the first week, William had adjusted his understanding of what he was dealing with. Charlotte Hayes was not a woman who needed rescuing. She was a woman who was rescuing herself one quiet, steady day at a time. And she had decided, for reasons he didn't yet fully understand, that Carter Ranch was the place she was going to do it. He didn't know how to feel about that. He'd spent 4 years being the only person responsible for this place, and there was a particular kind of loneliness in that which had become familiar enough that he'd stopped noticing it. It was like a weight you carry long enough that you forget you're carrying it. You just think of it as your normal posture. Having someone else in the house did not remove the weight, but it shifted it somehow, redistributed it in ways he was still trying to map. He lay awake on the 7th night, listening to the wind coming off the mountains and thinking about the way she'd stood on that station platform with Victor Blackwood in front of her and everyone watching, and she'd said in that quiet voice that carried, "I've also heard that the men here are proud of how hard everything is, like it proves something about them." He'd been thinking about that sentence all week. Not because of what it said about Victor, because of what it said about her. She'd been crying on that train. She'd been scared he'd seen it in her eyes in that first second before she'd set her chin and decided not to be. She was in a strange place with a man who'd told her flat out that he hadn't wanted her there. She was carrying a loss he was only beginning to understand. And when a powerful man had tried to make her feel small in front of a crowd, she hadn't run. She'd asked him a question. Does it? William Carter had been calling himself a practical man for 4 years. A man who dealt in facts, not feelings. A man who'd learned the hard way that hope was an expense he couldn't afford. He was beginning to suspect that Charlotte Hayes was going to challenge every one of those conclusions. He was not sure he was ready for that. He was not sure either that he had a choice. On the 10th day, the banker came. His name was Horace Elgin, and he drove out to Carter Ranch in a black buggy with the bank's seal on the side, and he sat at William's kitchen table and spread out papers while Charlotte made coffee that neither of them touched. William knew what the papers said. He'd been reading versions of the same papers for 2 years. The ranch owed money. The ranch had been missing payments. The bank's patience, which was not the bank's patience exactly, but the patience of whoever was behind the bank, whoever was putting pressure on Horace Elgin to put pressure on William, was running thin. "You have until March," Horace said. He was not unkind exactly. He was a man doing a job he didn't like, and he'd been doing it long enough to have become good at not looking people in the eye while he explained why their life was about to collapse. "If you can make 3 months of payments and reduce the principal by—" "I know the number," William said. "I know you know the number, William." "Then let's not pretend we need to talk about the number." Horace was quiet. Charlotte set the coffee down. "What would allow the bank to restructure the loan?" she asked. Both men looked at her. "I beg your pardon," Horace said. "The loan," Charlotte said, pulling up a chair and sitting down at the table as though she had been expected to participate in this conversation all along. "What would it take for the bank to restructure the terms in a way that gives the ranch more time to become profitable?" Horace looked at William. William looked at Charlotte. Typically, Horace said carefully. We'd want to see evidence of a viable plan. Income projections, some reason to believe that the ranch can turn around, Charlotte said. All right. She looked at William. Do you have the last 2 years of accounts? William's jaw tightened slightly. Charlotte. Do you have them? She said again. Not pushy, just direct. He got the accounts. She went through them with Horace Elgin for 2 hours. William sat there for the first 30 minutes, then got up and went outside, because he couldn't watch a woman he'd known for 10 days dissect the evidence of his failures with a banker in his own kitchen. He stood on the porch for a while looking at the north pasture, and then came back in because it was cold, and because he was, if he was honest with himself, curious. She was showing Horace the cattle records. She'd been keeping her own for the past week. That was the piece of paper she'd brought to supper on the third night. But there was more now, a fuller picture of what was there and what was possible. The herd's smaller than it should be, she was saying, but the quality is actually quite good. The problem isn't the cattle. The problem is that he's been trying to carry winter costs without adequate stockpiling in summer and fall. If you adjust the grazing rotation. She caught William's expression as he sat back down. I'm sorry, is this? Keep going, he said, gruffly. But he meant it. She kept going. By the time Horace Elgin left, the terms hadn't changed. Not yet. But Horace had agreed to bring what Charlotte had put together back to the bank, and he'd agreed to delay the next payment notice by 2 weeks, and he'd looked at Charlotte on his way out the door with an expression of frank surprise that he didn't quite bother to hide. Where'd you learn to do that? William asked after the black buggy had disappeared down the road. Charlotte was gathering the papers back into a neat stack. My father owned a dry goods business, she said. He wasn't good with money. He was good at everything else. Buying, selling, knowing what people needed. But numbers scared him, and he never told anyone that because he was proud. A pause. I learned to read the accounts when I was 14 because somebody had to. William looked at her. Did he know? He asked. That I was keeping his books. She smiled slightly, the first full smile he'd seen from her, a small, rueful thing. He knew something was keeping them. He preferred not to investigate. She set the papers down. He was a good man, just not a practical one. William thought about that. He sounds lonely, he said before he could stop himself. Charlotte looked at him, and this time the smile went somewhere more complicated. How was, she said quietly. After my mother died, he was very lonely. He just didn't know what to do about it, so he kept working and hoping that would be enough. She looked down at the papers. It wasn't. The kitchen was very quiet. Charlotte, William said, and then stopped because he didn't know what he'd been about to say. She waited. I'm glad you didn't get back on the train, he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she was thinking moved through her face too quickly and too privately for him to read. So am I, she said. Then she picked up the coffee cups and took them to the basin, and the conversation was over, and William sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she'd gone upstairs looking at the door and thinking that he had told himself this was a practical arrangement, a matter of necessity, a solution to a problem, and that he was going to have to be very careful because it was starting to feel like something else entirely. It was starting to feel like the beginning of something. And William Carter did not trust beginnings. He had learned the hard way how they could end. Outside in the dark. The Wyoming wind moved across the flats and rattled the porch railing that needed fixing, and somewhere out on the road that ran past Carter Ranch, a lamp went out on a black buggy headed back toward town. And in the room above the bank, Victor Blackwood looked at the report his man had given him and was quiet for a long time. Then he poured himself a drink. Find out who she is, he said. Find out everything. The bank papers were still on the kitchen table the next morning when William came downstairs. Charlotte had left them there stacked neatly held down by the salt cellar so they wouldn't shift in the draft from the door. She'd added something on top, a single sheet of paper in her own handwriting columns of numbers, organized in a way that William's records never had been, and at the bottom of the page, 2 words underlined twice salvageable, if. He stood there reading it with his coffee going cold in his hand. salvageable if. As though she'd been doing this her whole life. As though she'd walked into the ruins of a thing and seen the bones still holding. He heard her on the stairs and folded the paper quickly, which was a ridiculous thing to do, since it was his kitchen and his ranch, and she'd written it for him to read. He unfolded it again and was studying it with exaggerated interest when she came in. She glanced at him, glanced at the paper, and said nothing. Just went to the stove and stoked the fire up. "What does this number mean?" he asked, pointing to a figure in the middle column. "That's what you could clear on the spring cattle run if you hold back the 6 strongest steers instead of selling the whole lot in November," she said without turning around. "You've been selling at the worst time. Prices drop every fall because everyone sells at once. If you can carry 6 animals through winter, you sell in April when the market's thin and get nearly double." He stared at the paper. "I know the market's thin in April," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm asking why you haven't been using it." He was quiet for a moment. "Because carrying 6 animals through a Wyoming winter costs money I don't have in November. Not if you reduce your hay order on the south pasture animals and rotate them to the creek bed grazing 2 weeks longer than you've been doing." She turned around. "The creek bed grass is still good until late November. I walked it yesterday." He looked at her. "You walked the creek bed?" "Yes. In those shoes." She looked down at her feet. She was wearing a pair of his old work boots, 2 sizes too large, the extra length stuffed with wool. She looked back up at him and said perfectly evenly, "They were available." Something shifted in William's chest. He didn't name it. He put the paper down and drank his cold coffee and said, "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking," she said. "I thought about it." He thought about it for 3 days, and on the 4th day, he moved the south pasture animals to the creek bed, and he felt like a fool for not having thought of it himself. And he felt something else too, underneath that something warmer and less comfortable that he was not yet ready to examine. That was the 2nd week. The 3rd week was when the real trouble started. It began with the water. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Carter Ranch had been reliable for 12 years. William had built part of his grazing system around it, organized his pasture rotations to use it, depended on it, the way you depend on anything that has never failed you, which is to say, with the particular carelessness that comes from never having had to think about it. He noticed it on a Tuesday morning. The flow was lower than it should be. Not alarmingly low, just off. The kind of off that a man who has looked at the same thing for 12 years registers in his body before he registers it in his mind. He walked the creek upstream for half a mile and found nothing unusual. He walked it another quarter mile and found the problem. Someone had diverted it, not subtly. There'd been no attempt at subtlety. A wooden structure had been built across a narrow point, upstream crude fast work. The kind that gets done at night by men who aren't worried about being neat, because they're not worried about being caught, that redirected most of the water flow east. Away from Carter Ranch, toward the empty flats that bordered the Blackwood property line. William stood there looking at it for a long time. Then he turned around and walked back to the ranch house, and his face was so still and so controlled when he came in, that Charlotte, who was at the table working on the cattle records, put her pen down and turned in her chair. "What happened?" she said. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can we prove it was deliberate? The structure didn't build itself. Can we prove who built it?" He sat down. He hadn't meant to sit down. He'd meant to stay standing because standing felt more like doing something. But his legs put him in the chair anyway, and he sat there with his hands flat on the table and thought about Victor Blackwood's face on the train platform, and the report Horace Elgin would be bringing back to the bank, and the way the terms of that conversation were going to change now that the creek was diverted. "No," he said. "Not tonight." "Then we fix the water first," Charlotte said. "We document what we found, we fix it, and we figure out the rest after." "If we fix it, he'll just divert it again." "Maybe," she said. "But if we don't fix it, we lose the south pasture animals this week, and then we definitely can't make March." She stood up. "I'll get my coat." "You're not coming." "I'm not asking permission," she said in a tone that was not sharp but was absolutely final. "You need 2 people to dismantle that structure and redirect the water back. I'm one of two people here. Put your coat on." He put his coat on. They went out in the dark with lanterns and tools, and worked for 3 hours in the cold. And when the water was running right again, they stood there on the bank, watching it find its course. Both of them breathing hard, and Charlotte said quietly, "He's scared of you." William looked at her. "Blackwood. People who have everything don't spend energy on people who don't matter," she said. "He came to that station to look at you, not at me. I was looking at you." She paused. "He's scared of what you could become." William thought about that. He thought about it the whole walk home. I thought about the fact that no one had said anything like that to him in 4 years. Not because people were unkind, but because people had mostly agreed quietly, and without malice, that William Carter was a man whose best days were behind him. The ranch was struggling. He was alone. He'd missed his chance at love and at prosperity both, and the only real question was how long it would take him to accept the situation and sell to Victor Blackwood like a sensible man. Nobody had said he could become something worth fearing. He wasn't sure he believed it yet. But he noticed walking home behind Charlotte through the cold that he wanted to. Hell's Angels rode into Dust Creek on a Thursday. William heard them before he saw them, the sound of horses coming fast, more than a few carrying the particular rhythm of men who ride like they own the road. He was at the fence line on the north pasture when they came past 7 of them, and he straightened up and watched them go by. They were rough-looking men. He knew that kind. Men who had been outside the edges of respectable society long enough that they'd stopped trying to get back in. Worn leather and hard faces, and eyes that had seen too much and decided not to be surprised by anything else. They went into town without stopping, without looking at him. He thought nothing more of it until that evening when Charlotte came back from town. She'd taken the wagon in for supplies the first time she'd gone alone, which he'd almost objected to before stopping himself, because she was not his to object about, and she had proven repeatedly that she was capable of managing herself. He'd let her go. He'd spent the day not thinking about whether she was all right. He was thinking about it by the time the wagon came back. She came in with the supplies and set them on the kitchen table and started putting things away, and she was very quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Her usual quiet was purposeful, organized, moving toward something. This quiet was the quiet of a person deciding what to tell someone. "What?" he said. "There were men in town today," she said. "I saw them ride through." She paused with a tin of flour in her hands. "I know them," she said. "Some of them. From before. From back east." William put down what he was doing. "Who are they?" She set the flour tin on the shelf and turned around. "They're called the Hell's Angels," she said. "That's what they call themselves. They're not—" She stopped. Chose her words. "Most people look at them and see men to be afraid of. And some of them you should be afraid of. But most of them are just men who stopped fitting where they were supposed to fit." A pause. "My father knew them. When he was having trouble when the business first started going wrong, some of his creditors were the kind who send men, not letters. These men helped him." She looked at William carefully. "They're not bad people. They operate outside respectable channels. But they have their own code." William was quiet for a moment. "Why are they here?" "I don't know yet," she said. "One of them recognized me in the mercantile. He said—" She stopped. "Charlotte." She looked at him. "He said he had information about why my father's business really failed, about who was behind it." A pause that had weight in it. "He said the name Victor Blackwood." The kitchen was very still. William felt something move through him that was not exactly surprise. It was the feeling of a thing you haven't let yourself think, settling into certainty. It was the feeling of pieces aligning in a pattern you'd been avoiding looking at directly. "Victor," he said. He said Victor had holdings back east, investments, shell interests in businesses he didn't want his name attached to. She was watching William carefully. "He said one of those interests acquired my father's debt and then called it in all at once. 60 days to pay the full note or forfeit everything." Her jaw was tight. "My father couldn't pay it. Nobody could pay it in 60 days. That was the point." "Why?" William said. "Why would Victor care about a dry goods business in Philadelphia? He wouldn't, Charlotte said. Not the business. She held his eyes. He was clearing the way. For whatever comes next. She paused. For this. For here. William stared at her. You think he knew? William said slowly. He knew your sister. My sister had placed that advertisement. He knew who was coming. I think, Charlotte said carefully, that Victor Blackwood has been playing a much longer game than either of us realized. The implications of that moved through the room like cold air under a door. He wanted to be sure you'd have a reason to fail, William said. Not a question. Just the truth arriving unavoidable. He wanted to make sure anyone who might help you had nothing left to offer, she said quietly. He thought he was sending a broken woman with no resources and no leverage. She paused. He didn't account for your sister being very specific in that advertisement about what she was looking for. William thought about Margaret's letter. She's not what you think. She's had a hard time of it. He thought about Charlotte walking the creek bed in his oversized boots. He thought about 2 hours at the kitchen table with Horace Elgin. He underestimated you, William said. Men like him usually do, Charlotte said. It wasn't bitter, it was just true. And that's the only advantage we have right now, so we need to use it before he figures out his mistake. William stood up. What did the man tell you? He asked. The one from the angels. What information does he have? He says he has documents, Charlotte said. Financial records, from the Philadelphia transaction and others like it. He says Victor has done this before, more than once, more than twice. He buys debt cheap from desperate men and then calls it all in at once. Ruins the businesses, acquires the pieces. She paused. He's been building an empire out of other people's collapses. And these men have proof. They have paper, she said. Whether paper is proof depends on who's looking at it. William walked to the window and stood there not looking at anything in particular. In his mind, he was running through the county, the faces, the histories, the quiet failures that had happened over the last decade. Ranches sold for less than they were worth. Businesses closed suddenly. Good men who'd had promising starts and then simply stopped. He'd never connected them. They were just the landscape of a hard life in a hard place. Now he connected them. How many? He said. I don't know yet, Charlotte said. But the man, his name is Roy, he said enough to matter. He said enough to take to someone who could do something about it. Who? William said. The county sheriff is Victor's man. I know. She was quiet for a moment. There's a federal marshal who passes through every few months. He was in Laramie last week. Roy says he might still be there. William turned around. A federal marshal, he said flatly. Against Victor Blackwood and the county government. With documents held by a group of men nobody in this county will believe a word from. Yes, Charlotte said. And us. Yes. He looked at her. She looked back at him without flinching, without the pretense of optimism she didn't feel. It's not a good position, she said. I know it's not a good position, but it's the position we're in. He almost laughed. It wasn't funny. But there was something so precise about the way she said it, the position we're in, like they'd been in positions together for years. Like this was just the latest in a long series of difficult spots they'd navigated side by side. Like there had never been any question that it was we. He noticed that. He let himself notice it just for a second, and then he put it away somewhere for later. Tomorrow, he said, you introduce me to Roy. Roy was a big man, bigger than William, with a face that had been broken at least once and set itself without much professional assistance. He was sitting outside the Dust Creek Saloon when they walked up drinking coffee instead of whiskey, which was the first thing that recalibrated William's assessment. He stood when he saw Charlotte, which was the second thing. You came back, Roy said. I said I would, Charlotte said. Most people say that. Roy looked at William, not sizing him up exactly, more like reading him the way you read a landscape for what it might do to you. You're Carter. I am, William said. She told you. She told me. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I knew her father. He was a decent man who got eaten alive by a shark in a white hat. What happened to him was wrong, and I couldn't stop it then, because I didn't have what I needed. He looked at Charlotte. I have it now. Why now? William asked. If you've had these documents. I didn't have them before, Roy said. I had pieces. Then 2 months ago, a man who used to work for Blackwood's Eastern interests decided he was afraid of God more than he was afraid of Victor Blackwood, and he came to find me. He reached into his coat. What he brought. He set a folded packet of papers on the table between them. You read that, and tell me what you think. William picked it up. He read. He read standing up, which turned into sitting down, which turned into a very long, very quiet few minutes, during which the only sound was the saloon doing its business on the other side of the wall. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at Roy. How many ranches? He said. In Wyoming alone 6. Roy's voice was flat. The Patterson place, the Erickson family. Old Colin McGrady, you remember him, he sold out in '82. Thought he just had bad luck. He didn't have bad luck, William said. No, Roy said. He had Victor Blackwood. William looked at Charlotte. Her face was very controlled, and he knew by now what controlled looked like on her, knew it meant there was something underneath that she was holding firmly by the collar. Your father is in there, William said quietly. Not a question. I know, she said. Charlotte. I know, she said again. Steadier. I read it. Roy showed me before you came. She looked at him. I've had a night to sit with it. I'm all right. She was not entirely all right. He could see that clearly. But she was functional, and she was forward-facing, and that was Charlotte. She processed pain in motion. She didn't stop to feel it until she'd done what needed to be done. He understood that now. He'd been watching her do it from the first day. All right, he said. He looked at Roy. What do we need to do? Get this to someone who can act on it, Roy said. The federal marshal in Laramie. His name's Haddix. He's been looking for something to bring against Blackwood for 2 years. He just hasn't had anything solid enough. This. He nodded at the papers. This is solid. Blackwood will move against us the moment he realizes what we're doing, William said. Yes, Roy said. Probably before. He's got informants in town. He'll know you came to see me today. William sat with that. How long to reach Laramie and get back? 3 days riding hard, Roy said. 2.5 if the weather holds. I'll go, William said. No, Charlotte said. He looked at her. You can't leave the ranch for 3 days, she said. The cattle need daily attention right now, and if Blackwood has informants in town, he'll know you're gone, and he'll move on the property while you're riding. She paused. Roy should go. Oh, he knows Haddix. Haddix knows him. Roy nodded slowly. She's right. I've done business with Haddix before. He'll hear me out faster than he'd hear a rancher he doesn't know. And you stay here, Charlotte said to William. You stay here and you hold this place, and you don't give Victor Blackwood any reason to move before Roy gets back. William looked at her for a moment. And if he moves anyway? Then we deal with it, she said. Together. He held her gaze. There it was again. That we dropped so naturally into the conversation that it barely made a sound. Like it had always been there. Like the idea of doing any of this separately had never occurred to her. He turned to Roy. How soon can you leave, say, tonight? Roy said. Better to move before Blackwood's people can get word out. Take this with you, William said, sliding the papers across. Guard them. With my life, Roy said, and he said it so simply and so completely that William believed him. They stood. Roy shook William's hand, then looked at Charlotte. He'd be proud, Roy said. Your father, for what you're doing here. Charlotte's face didn't break. But something behind her eyes did briefly, quietly, a small fracture she sealed almost before it opened. I know, she said, barely above a whisper. I know he would. Roy left. William and Charlotte walked back to the ranch in the long Wyoming dusk, neither of them speaking. The distance between them on the road, somehow smaller than it had been on the way into town. The trouble started 2 days later, exactly as Roy had predicted. It started with Gideon Walsh, who ran the general store, and whose credit at the Blackwood Land Office was William now understood, not incidental. Gideon sent word that he couldn't fill the Carter Ranch supply order. Nothing dramatic, just regrets, no explanation, a short note delivered by his boy. After that, Thomas at the feed store. Then the blacksmith who declined to shoe the ranch horses for the upcoming season, also without explanation. Charlotte collected each message without comment and added them to a stack on the table. On the third evening, she set the stack in front of William. "He's cutting the supply lines," she said, methodically. "He's done this before." She tapped the stack. "This is the same pattern as what happened to the Erickson family. You cut someone off from the town's services, and they either capitulate or they exhaust themselves trying to source everything independently. We still have the wagon," William said. "Laramie is 2 days." "He knows that too," Charlotte said. "He'll move on the property before we can make a Laramie run." She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Unless he doesn't know Roy went to Laramie, unless he thinks Roy is still here. William looked at her. "Roy left 3 nights ago." "I know," she said. "But 2 of his men stayed. I asked them to." She held William's eyes carefully. "I asked them to stay visible in town. Make themselves seen. Let Victor's informants report back that the whole group was still at the saloon." William stared at her. "You planned that," he said. "Before Roy left. You already thought of this." "I thought Victor would move fast," she said. "I thought we needed him to think we hadn't moved faster." She paused. "I should have told you." "Yes," he said. "And then because it was true, you were right." She let out a slow breath. "Roy should be back tomorrow," she said, "or the day after. If Haddix is in Laramie, and if he'll move on this, we need to hold together until then." "What if Haddix won't move?" William said. "What if the papers aren't enough?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Then we make them be enough," she said. "We find the other families, the Pattersons, the Ericksons, whoever else Blackwood's done this to. We get them to speak. You can't silence 6 families as easily as you can silence 1. "You can't get those families in a room together," William said. "They've moved on. Some of them left the territory entirely." "Then we write letters," Charlotte said. "Tonight, right now." She stood up and went for paper and pen. "You tell me their names and what you know about where they went, and I'll draft the letters." He told her. She wrote. They sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, and outside the wind was doing what it always did in Wyoming in November, and the ranch was quiet. And William watched Charlotte write letter after letter in her careful handwriting, and he thought about what Roy had said. He'd be proud your father. And he thought about his own father, who had built this ranch with his hands and his back, and who had told William once the year before he died, "The land is only as good as the people who work it, son, and the people are only as good as who they've got beside them." He'd forgotten that. He'd spent 4 years trying to prove it wasn't true. Charlotte looked up from the page and caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She held his gaze for a second, then looked back down. She kept writing. He kept watching. "He thought I am in serious trouble. Not the financial kind. Not the Victor Blackwood kind. The other kind. The kind his father had been talking about." Roy came back on the 4th day. He came back in the mid-afternoon riding hard, and William met him at the gate with Charlotte a step behind, and one look at Roy's face told him everything before Roy said a word. "Haddix is coming," Roy said. Charlotte made a sound, small, controlled, immediately suppressed. "When?" William said. 3 days, Roy said. "He wants to move before word gets to Blackwood. He's bringing 2 deputies. He looked at William, then at Charlotte. "He wants your testimony, both of you. He wants the cattle records, the financial documents, the supply refusals, everything you've documented." "We have it," Charlotte said quietly. "All of it." Roy nodded. Then he said, "There's something else." He looked at William directly. "Haddix told me Victor Blackwood filed a notice with the county court last week. He's claiming the creek diversion was a correction of a pre-existing encroachment on Blackwood land. He's got a surveyor backing him up. He's trying to make it legal retroactively." William's jaw tightened. "He's moving," Charlotte said, voice very even. "He knows Roy went to Laramie." "How?" William said. "Because he's been playing this game longer than we have," she said. There was no panic in her voice. Something harder than panic. Something that had been tested by a father who'd been crushed by this same machine and had come out the other side of the grief with her eyes open. "It doesn't matter how. It matters what we do in 3 days." She looked at Roy. "Tell Haddix," she said, "that we'll have everything ready. And tell him whatever legal action Blackwood files before he arrives, we will not respond to it. We will not go to the county courthouse. We will not engage the county court in any capacity." A pause. "We wait for federal jurisdiction. Is that clear?" Roy looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at William. "Where did you find her?" Roy said. William glanced at Charlotte. She was already turning back toward the house, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "She found me," he said quietly. "She stepped off a train." Roy watched her go. "Hold on to that," Roy said. "Whatever you have to do to hold on to that, Carter, do it." William didn't answer. He didn't need to. He was already thinking the same thing. The 3 days before Marshal Haddix arrived were the longest of William Carter's life, and he had lived through some very long days. I didn't sleep much. Not because he was afraid exactly, fear was too simple a word for what moved through him during those nights. It was more like the feeling you get standing at the edge of something high, where your body understands the drop before your mind has finished calculating it. He'd lie awake listening to the ranch settle around him, listening to the wind, listening for anything that shouldn't be there. And sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, he'd hear Charlotte moving in the room above the soft, restless sound of someone else who wasn't sleeping either. And that sound, strange as it was the thing that kept him from getting up and doing something reckless. She was still thinking, so he should still be thinking. He stayed in the bed and thought. He thought about Victor Blackwood's surveyor and the county court filing. He thought about 6 families, the Pattersons, the Ericksons, old Colum McGrady, and the others who'd had their livelihoods quietly dismantled by a man in a clean white hat who smiled at church on Sundays. He thought about Charlotte's father in Philadelphia, running a dry goods store, not knowing that the debt he couldn't pay had been engineered to be unpayable. He thought about how a man does that to other people, how you wake up every morning and make those decisions, and he couldn't find the bottom of it. There wasn't one. On the morning of the 2nd day, Charlotte came downstairs with the ranch records under her arm and a look on her face that William had learned to read as I have been up since 4 in the morning, rearranging the way we're going to handle this. She sat down and spread everything out without preamble. "I found something," she said. He sat down across from her. "The creek diversion," she said. "Victor filed that the day after Roy left for Laramie. He claimed it corrected an encroachment." She tapped a paper. "But look at this. The original land survey from 1871 when your father settled this property. The creek boundary is clearly marked. Your father's deed includes riparian rights explicitly. Victor's surveyor would have to fabricate an entirely new survey to contradict this." William looked at it. "Can he do that, fabricate a survey?" "He can try," she said. "But a fabricated survey and an original deed in federal court are 2 different things." She looked at him. "Haddix needs to see this deed before anything else, before the financial documents, before the cattle records, before any testimony. The moment Haddix has this deed in federal jurisdiction, any county court action on the creek becomes moot." William pulled the deed toward him. He'd seen this document dozens of times without really seeing it. It lived in the tin box under the floorboard in the study, along with his father's other papers, and he'd opened the box maybe 4 times in 12 years. "My father spent 6 months negotiating those riparian rights," he said. He didn't know why he said it. It just came out. Charlotte looked at him across the table. "He knew they mattered," she said quietly. "He knew everything mattered," William said. "He was better at this than I've been." "Don't do that," she said. He looked up. "Don't make this about what you should have done differently," she said. Her voice was direct, not unkind. "You held this ranch for 12 years alone after your father died, and 4 years after—" She stopped. A brief, careful pause. "After your loss, you held it. That's not nothing, William. That's actually quite a lot." He was quiet. "Nobody told me that before," he said. The words came out lower than he intended. "I know," she said. "Someone should have." They looked at each other across the table for a moment that was longer than it should have been, and neither of them did anything about that. And then Charlotte looked back down at the documents and said in a completely businesslike voice, "I'm going to organize these by date. Can you make coffee?" Haimada coffee. His hands weren't entirely steady, and he didn't think it was fear. Victor moved on the second night. Not subtly, not with surveyors or bank notices or supply refusals. He was done with subtlety. William understood that later, piecing it together. Understanding mix, and had decided that the time for quiet pressure had passed, and something faster was needed. Two of Victor's men came in the night and opened the gate on the south pasture, all 6 of the steers. William had held back the ones Charlotte had identified. The ones that would sell for double in April were gone by morning. Not rustled exactly. Just quietly walked out through an open gate and disappeared into the darkness toward the Blackwood property line, where they'd be rebranded and absorbed into 3,000 other animals, and be absolutely impossible to prove had ever been William Carter's. William found the open gate at first light. He stood there for a moment, looking at the empty pasture. He counted the animals that remained. He counted again. He counted the absence of 6 specific animals that had represented his best chance of meeting March. Then he walked back to the house. Charlotte was in the kitchen. She saw his face and stood up from the table without a word. "The south pasture steers," he said. Her face changed. "All 6, she said. "All 6. She sat back down. She pressed her hands flat on the table, the way he'd seen her do when she was holding something in place inside herself. "All right," she said. "All right." The word was doing a lot of work. It was not all right, obviously, and they both knew it, but she said it like a decision. Like a door she was closing firmly on the part of her that wanted to react, and opening instead to the part that needed to think. "Can we prove it was him?" she said. "Same answer as the creek," he said. "Not without a witness." "Roy's men," she said immediately. "2 of his men are still in town. Did they see anything last night?" "I don't know yet." "Find out," she said. "Right now. Go find out." She was already pulling a piece of paper toward her, already thinking about what the loss of those 6 animals meant to the March numbers, already recalculating. "I'll figure out what we have left to work with. Go." He went. He rode to town in under 20 minutes, which was fast for that road, and he found Roy's 2 men, a quiet Texan named Dell, and a bigger, darker man they called Peso, eating breakfast at the back of the saloon. Dell put down his fork when William walked in. "You have a problem," William said. "Tell me," Dell said. William told him. Dell looked at Peso. Peso looked at his plate for a second, then back up. "3 horses," Peso said. "I heard 3 horses going south around 2 in the morning. I thought it was travelers." "South," William said. "South, southeast," Peso said. "Toward the Blackwood line." William sat down. "Would you swear to that?" he said. "In front of a federal marshal." Peso looked at Dell. Dell gave a small nod. "I'd swear it," Peso said. "It's what I heard." William sat there for a moment, thinking about what that was worth, and what it wasn't worth, and what it meant that Victor had escalated from paperwork to theft in the span of 48 hours. "He's panicking," Charlotte had said. "People who have everything don't spend energy on people who don't matter." Victor was spending a lot of energy, which meant he was running out of time, and he knew it. Which meant Haddix was coming, and Victor knew that too. "Stay visible," William told Dell and Peso. "Stay in town. Don't leave. If Victor's men approach you, don't engage, just be seen." He stood up. "And thank you." "Don't thank us," Dell said. "Just make sure what Roy went to get is worth the ride." William rode back to the ranch. He came through the door, and Charlotte looked up from her papers. She read his face. "They heard them," she said. "Peso heard 3 horses, south-southeast, 2 in the morning." Charlotte exhaled. "That's not proof of theft, but it's corroboration of movement toward the Blackwood line on the same night." She tapped her pen on the paper. combined with the gate being open from outside, which I can show the latch was lifted from the roadside, not the pasture side, and the dates of the other escalations. She looked at him. It builds a picture. Pictures aren't convictions, William said. No, she agreed. But they're enough to get haddocks looking at Blackwood's herd records. And if those steers are in that herd, they'll be branded. Your brand won't wash out in 2 days. She held his eyes. That's what we need haddocks for. Legal authority to look. 1 day left. 1 day until haddocks arrived. William thought we just have to hold 1 more day. And that was when Victor Blackwood himself rode up to Carter Ranch. William heard the horses first. More than 1-3, he thought, and he was at the window before they reached the gate. He saw Victor's white hat from 50 yards out and felt something cold and certain settle in his chest. He turned around. Charlotte was already standing up, already watching him. He's here, William said. Her chin came up. That small, decisive motion he'd first seen on the station platform, the motion that meant she had decided how she was going to face this. Don't let him inside, she said. I wasn't going to. And don't threaten him. Whatever he says, don't threaten him. William opened the front door and walked out onto the porch and stood there. Victor pulled up in the gate with 2 men behind him. Not the ranch hands from the station. Different men, larger, with the particular stillness of men paid to be available for unpleasant tasks. Victor himself dismounted easily for a man of 60, tied his horse himself, and walked up the path with his hands loose at his sides and his white hat pulled low against the morning light. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked at William. He didn't look toward the door or the windows, but he knew Charlotte was there. Victor Blackwood always knew where the relevant people were. Morning, William, he said, pleasantly. Victor, William said. I came to have a plain conversation, Victor said. Man to man. I think we're past the point where dancing around things serves either of us. Say what you came to say, William said. Victor took his hat off, held it in both hands, which was a gesture meant to look like respect, and functioned as a subtle reminder that he was the kind of man who'd learned all the gestures. You're in a bad position, he said. I think you know that. The bank is coming in the spring. You've lost stock. Your supply lines are complicated, let's say. And now I hear you've been talking to federal men, which tells me you're desperate and grasping for help from people who are not going to be as useful as you hope. Does it, William said. It does. Victor's voice was even almost gentle. The voice of a man who'd had many versions of this conversation and had learned exactly which tone made people sign things. Here's my offer, William. It's the same offer I've made before, but I'm making it again because I'm a reasonable man. I'll buy this land at market rate. I'll absorb your debt with the bank. You walk away clear. He paused. You and your... His eyes moved to the door behind William. Your arrangement. You both walk away with enough to start over somewhere. William looked at him for a long moment. You took my cattle, William said. Victor's expression didn't change. I have no idea what you're referring to. 6 steers, south pasture, 2 nights ago. That's a serious accusation, Victor said. You'd need proof for something like that. I'd be very careful making accusations you can't support, especially with a federal marshal potentially in the area. Makes a man look unstable, makes the bank nervous. William said nothing. I want this land. William, Victor said, dropping the pleasantry like a coat he'd been wearing in warm weather and didn't need any more. I've wanted it for 6 years. It borders my north range, and I need the water access. This has always been about the creek. You know that. I've been patient about it because patience is cheaper than lawyers, but my patience has a bottom. He put his hat back on. Sell me the land. Name your price within reason. We can have papers drawn up by end of week, and this whole unpleasant business is over. The door opened behind William. He didn't turn around. He heard her footsteps on the porch boards, steady and unhurried. And then Charlotte was standing beside him, not behind him, not at a distance, but right beside him, close enough that her shoulder was almost touching his arm. Victor looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes, fast, quickly controlled. He'd underestimated her before. I was recalibrating now. William could see it happening and felt a grim satisfaction at the slight tightening around Victor's mouth. "Miss Hayes," Victor said. "Mr. Blackwood," Charlotte said. Her voice was completely calm. "I heard what you offered." "Then you understand." "I understand that you need this creek," she said. "And I understand why. Your north range is drier than your surveys let on. I've heard the ranchers who share that border talk about it. You've been overgrazing for 3 seasons trying to compensate." She looked at him with those careful eyes. "You don't just want this land, you need it. And a man who needs something badly enough will do whatever is required to get it." She paused. "Including what you did to my father." Victor was very still. "I don't know what stories you've been told," he said. His voice had dropped a degree. "I've been told documents," Charlotte said. "Not stories, documents, dated, signed, traceable." She held his eyes. "How many ranches is it now, Mr. Blackwood? How many families do you remember their names? Do you think about them?" A beat of silence that had considerable weight. "I think," Victor said quietly, "that you are making a very serious mistake." "I think," Charlotte said, "that we are finally understanding each other." Victor looked at her for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. Then he looked at William. "Last chance," Victor said. "Get off my property," William said. Victor put his hand to his hat brim, a mocking half-salute, and turned and walked back to his horse. He mounted without hurrying. At the gate he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "You've got 1 day," he said. "After that, what happens is on you." He rode away. William and Charlotte stood on the porch and watched him go. Neither of them moved until the horses were completely out of sight and the sound had faded. Then Charlotte said quietly, "He knows about Haddocks." "Yes," William said, "which means he'll move tonight, before Haddocks arrives tomorrow." "Yes." She was quiet for 3 seconds. "We need Roy's men here, at the ranch, tonight." "I'll ride into town." "I'll ride," she said. "You stay here. If you leave and he moves on the property while you're gone." She stopped. "I'll be faster in town. I know where Dell and Peso are. You stay here and—" She stopped. Something in his expression stopped her. He was looking at her with an intensity she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful, guarded attention of a man keeping his distance, but something more direct, more undefended, like a door swung open that had been latched for a long time. "Charlotte," he said. "William, be careful," he said. Just those 2 words. But the way he said them, was not the way a man talks to a practical partner in a difficult business situation. It was the way a man talks when he's realized fully and finally what he has to lose. She looked at him. "I'll be back in an hour," she said, softer than her usual voice, as if she'd heard everything he hadn't said. She went. He stood on the porch and watched her ride out, and then went inside and checked his rifle and waited. She was back in 50 minutes with Dell and Peso behind her. They stationed themselves, Dell at Peso at the north fence line, and William and Charlotte settled in to wait out the night. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp low and the documents stacked and organized and ready, and William tried to think about tactics and kept thinking about other things. Around 9 o'clock, Charlotte said without looking up from the paper she was reviewing, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. "The woman," she said, carefully. "The one who you lost." The word before hung between them. He knew what she was asking. He'd been waiting on some level for her to ask, dreading it and half wanting it at the same time, because there is a particular loneliness in carrying something no one asks you about. "Her name was Helen," he said. Charlotte looked up. "We were engaged," he said. "She came out here with her family. They were settling near Laramie, and we met at the county fair. She was—" He stopped. "She was kind. That was the main thing about her. She was a very kind person." He was quiet for a moment. "She got sick. It went fast. Faster than anyone expected. She was gone before spring." Charlotte said nothing. She just watched him, giving him the space to continue, or not, the way she did everything, without pressure, without hurry. "Afterward," he said, "I decided I'd rather be empty than go through that again. It seemed like a reasonable calculation." It does seem reasonable, she said. From the outside. He looked at her. From the inside, she said carefully. I think it cost you things you don't notice you're paying. She paused. My father did the same thing after my mother. He shut the door and kept working and thought that was enough. And maybe it was maybe he genuinely couldn't bear the alternative. She looked down at the table. But I think he was lonelier than he ever let on. I think the closing off had its own kind of pain that he just had more control over. She was quiet. Control isn't the same as not hurting. William sat with that for a while. No, he said, it isn't. The lamp flickered in a draft. Charlotte, he said. Yes. I'm glad Margaret sent that letter, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face did something complicated and true. So am I, she said. They sat there for a moment more, and then outside Dell let out a sharp whistle, one note the signal they'd agreed on, and they were both on their feet before the sound finished. 3 men came through the east fence, which was where William would have come if he'd been trying to reach the barn without being seen. They came on foot quietly, and they might have made it if Peso hadn't been at the north fence line and seen their silhouette against the sky. Dell's whistle brought everyone to position. William went out the back with his rifle. Charlotte and he'd told her to stay inside, and she had listened to exactly as much of that as she intended to, came out behind him with the short-barrel shotgun he kept by the door. I told you to stay inside, he said, moving fast and low. I heard you, she said, matching him step for step. There was no time for the rest of that argument. Dell had intercepted 2 of the men near the barn. There was shouting, not gunshots, not yet the kind of confrontation that's trying to figure out whether it becomes something worse. William came around the barn's east side and found Dell standing with his rifle leveled at 2 men who were not Victor's usual ranch hands. These were hired men, hired recently by the look of them, wearing new coats that didn't belong to the Wyoming winter yet. The 3rd man had gotten to the barn door. William got there at the same moment. They came around opposite corners and nearly collided, and for a second they were close enough that William could see the man's face clearly. Young, maybe 25, scared under the bravado, the expression of someone who'd taken a job without being fully told what the job was. Don't, William said. Quiet. Absolute. The young man held very still. I know you didn't come up with this on your own, William said. And I know whoever hired you is not going to be in any position to protect you from federal charges after tomorrow. He held the young man's eyes. But tonight, right now, you are standing on my property with what I assume is a lantern in your coat, and if you burn my barn, I will make sure you are held personally responsible, regardless of who put you up to it. A pause. Or you can leave, right now, all 3 of you, and I won't name you to the marshal tomorrow. I'll say the property was approached, but the men turned back. The young man looked at him. Then he looked past William at Charlotte, who was standing 6 feet back with the shotgun held with complete steadiness, and an expression that left no ambiguity about her willingness to use it. Turn back, the young man said. He said it to his companions, not to William, as a decision. They turned back. They left the way they'd come fast, not running quite the careful, rapid walk of men trying not to run. William stood and watched them go until he was sure of the direction, and then he lowered the rifle and let out the breath he'd been holding since Dell's whistle. He turned around. Charlotte lowered the shotgun. They looked at each other. You were going to shoot, he said. If I needed to, she said simply. You've never... He stopped, not sure where the sentence was going. I grew up on my uncle's farm, she said. I told you, before things changed. She glanced down at the shotgun. It's been a while, but I remembered. William looked at her in the dark, and he felt something break open in his chest. Not painfully. Nothing like pain. The way ice breaks in the first week of spring. Not violently, but inevitably, because the season has finally changed, and the thaw is simply what comes next. He reached out and took the shotgun from her gently. Not because she couldn't hold it, but because his hands needed something to do, besides reach for her. Thank you, he said. Stop thanking me, she said, for the 3rd or 4th time. But her voice was different this time, softer, a little unsteady, in a way he hadn't heard from her before. Dell appeared around the barn corner. "They're gone." Peso tracked them to the road. "They're heading back toward Blackwood Land." "Good," William said. "You know this means he knows it didn't work," Dell said. "I know," William said, "which means tomorrow matters more than it did this morning." Dell nodded. He looked at Charlotte with an expression that was from a man like Dell about as close to open admiration as the range allowed. Then he went back to his post without saying anything else because nothing else needed saying. William and Charlotte walked back to the house. Inside, she set the shotgun by the door and stood for a moment with her back to him, and he could see from the line of her shoulders that the steadiness she'd held all night was costing her something, now that the immediate need for it had passed. The particular exhaustion that comes not from the body, but from the sustained effort of being braver than you feel. "Charlotte," he said. She turned around. Her face was still composed, but her eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "We held," she said. "We held," he agreed. She nodded once to herself like something being logged and filed. Then she looked at him and she said, "One more day." "One more day," he said. They stood there for a moment in the kitchen with the lamp between them and the long night behind them and Marshall Haddock's one day away. And William Carter looked at the woman standing in his kitchen, the woman who had walked the creek bed in his oversized boots, who had argued riparian rights with a banker who had stood on his porch and asked Victor Blackwood, does it in a voice that carried further than a shout, who had come down those stairs tonight with a shotgun and placed herself beside him without being asked. And he understood with the simple and total certainty of a man who has spent years avoiding a truth, finally letting himself see it. That whatever he'd thought this was when he'd put $10 in his coat pocket and driven to the train station, it had always been going to be this. Outside, the Wyoming night did what it always did. The wind, the dark pressed down. The stars were very far away and very many. Inside Carter Ranch, two people who'd both had everything taken from them sat back down at the kitchen table and waited for morning. And for the first time in 4 years, William Carter was not alone. Marshall Haddock's arrived at 10:30 in the morning, which was 2 hours later than Roy had said, and 40 minutes after William had stopped pretending he wasn't watching the road. He came with 2 deputies and Roy 4 horses, moving at a working pace, not urgent, not leisurely, the pace of men who have a job to do and intend to do it correctly. William was on the porch when they rode up. Charlotte was behind him in the doorway. Dell and Peso had been awake since before dawn, and they stood near the barn with the particular stillness of men accustomed to waiting for things to either happen or not happen. Haddock's was younger than William had expected. Maybe 45, lean through the face with pale gray eyes that moved around the property in a single efficient sweep before he'd finished dismounting. He wore his badge plainly, not prominently. It was there, you'd see it, but he wasn't wearing it for theater. That told William something. "Carter," Haddock said, extending his hand. "Marshall," William said. They shook. Haddock's looked past him at Charlotte. "Miss Hayes," he said. "Marshall Haddock's," she said. "Thank you for coming." "Roy's a persuasive man when he has paper to back him up," Haddock said. He looked around the property once more, the barn, the fence line, Dell and Peso by the wall. "You had trouble last night." It wasn't a question. Roy had clearly briefed him on the road. 3 men, William said. They turned back. "Names?" "I didn't get names. Young. Hired recently, I could tell by the coats. They didn't come from Blackwood's regular crew." Haddock's nodded slowly. "He's using outside men. Smart enough not to use his own people for this." He said it without particular judgment, just reading a situation the way he'd read many situations. "All right, let's go inside and you can show me what you have." They went inside. Charlotte had the documents already organized on the table, the deed with the riparian rights at the top, then the financial records. Roy had brought from the east, then her own cattle records and the supply refusal notices, then the bank correspondence, then the creek diversion documentation. 12 years of William's history, and 6 months of her own assembled into a case that was careful and complete and devastating if you followed it through. Haddix sat down and read. He read for a long time. His deputies stood near the door. Roy sat in the corner chair. William stood by the window. Charlotte sat at the table across from Haddix and answered his questions as he went. He asked several precise and technical the questions of a man who understood both law and fraud and was mapping what he was reading against what was actionable. 40 minutes and Haddix set the last page down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Philadelphia transaction alone is federal wire fraud. The creek diversion against a deed with explicit riparian rights is federal property interference." He paused. "The cattle theft I can pursue, but I'll need to inspect Blackwood's herd records, and he'll fight that access through the county court." "Can you compel it?" Charlotte asked. "With what you've given me, yes," Haddix said. "It'll take 48 hours to file the federal instruments, but yes." He looked at William. "He's going to know I'm here within the hour. He has a man at the post office who watches the road." "He already knows," William said. "He came here yesterday. He knew you were coming." Haddix looked at him sharply. "He came here himself. Yesterday morning." "What did he say?" "He offered to buy. Then he told me I had one day." Haddix leaned back in the chair. Something moved across his face, not quite satisfaction, not quite anger, something that was the feeling of a man who has been chasing something for a long time and just heard the sound of it getting closer. "He threatened you," Haddix said. "Directly, in front of a witness." "In front of 2 witnesses," Charlotte said. "Dell was at the barn. He heard it." Haddix looked at Roy. Roy nodded. "All right," Haddix said and stood up. "Here's what happens now." Chime. What happened now was that Marshal Haddix rode into Dust Creek and served notice at the county courthouse before noon. William and Charlotte followed in the wagon because Haddix had asked them to be present, and because William would not have stayed at the ranch anyway, which Charlotte knew without being told. Roy rode ahead. Dell and Peso came behind. It was a small procession into a small town, but small towns notice everything, and by the time they reached the courthouse, there were people on the street watching. The postmaster. 2 of the ranch wives from the station. Gideon Walsh from the general store standing in his doorway with his arms crossed, watching in a way that was trying to look neutral and wasn't quite managing it. The county sheriff. A man named Pruitt, who had Victor Blackwood's goodwill stamped so plainly in his posture that it might as well have been a brand came out of the courthouse as Haddix was tying his horse. "Marshal," Pruitt said. His voice was careful. "Wasn't expecting you." "Nobody usually is," Haddix said pleasantly. "I need to file some instruments. Federal jurisdiction. I'll need access to the property survey records from the last 15 years. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "Survey records are county property. You'd need—" "I have what I need," Haddix said, and held up the federal documents. He said it with no heat whatsoever. Just the simple fact of a man with the correct paperwork. Pruitt looked at the documents. He looked at the badge. He looked past Haddix at William, and the look he gave William was the look of a man calculating how badly he'd miscalculated something. "I'll need to notify Mr. Blackwood," Pruitt said. "That's your business," Haddix said. "My business is in the courthouse, if you'll excuse me." He walked inside. William tied the wagon and helped Charlotte down, and they followed. And as William stepped onto the courthouse steps, he felt the eyes of the town on his back, not hostile, not warm, the complicated, watchful attention of a community that has been living under a particular power for so long, it doesn't know which way to lean when that power gets challenged. Let them watch, he thought. Let them see how it goes. Inside it moved fast. Haddix knew the process the way he knew his own hands, and the clerk, a young man named Tate, who had no allegiance to Victor Blackwood, and was clearly relieved that this was happening above his authority level, pulled the survey records without argument. Charlotte stood beside William and watched Haddix work. "He's good," she said quietly. "He knows what he's doing." William agreed. "We're going to win this," she said, not triumphantly, not with relief exactly, just the quiet settling of a person who has been in fight mode for so long that the beginning of the end still feels like something to be cautious about. "Don't say that yet," William said. "I know," she said. "I know, but—" "Charlotte." He looked at her. Don't say it yet. She looked back at him and understood what he meant, which was not superstition, but rather the experience of a man who had learned not to count on things until they were fully in his hand. She nodded. They went back to watching Haddocks. 20 minutes later, Victor Blackwood walked into the courthouse. He came in with Pruitt and a man. William didn't recognize a lawyer from the look of him. City clothes and a leather case. Victor's face was controlled, but his eyes were doing something fast underneath that control, moving between Haddocks and the documents, and William and Charlotte calculating. "Marshal Haddocks," Victor said. His voice was perfectly even. "I understand you're pursuing some kind of inquiry." "I'm filing federal instruments," Haddocks said without looking up. "You're welcome to have your attorney review them. It's public record." The lawyer moved to Haddocks's side and began reading. Victor stood in the center of the room and looked at William. "You brought a federal marshal onto my county," he said. Low, very controlled. "It's not your county," William said. "I've built this county," Victor said. "Everything here was built on other people's losses," Charlotte said. Victor looked at her. The room went very still. Charlotte held his gaze with that quality. She had the quality he'd tried to break on the station platform, and failed, the quality of a woman who had been through worse than his stare, and had decided what she was made of on the other side of it. "I know what you did to my father," she said, quietly, clearly, the kind of voice that fills a room without raising itself. "I know the date the debt was acquired. I know the name of the firm. I know the 60-day notice was issued the same week my father tried to refinance through a bank that suddenly declined his application." She paused. "I know which bank. I know who you knew there." Another pause. "I have the papers, Mr. Blackwood, and so does Marshal Haddocks." Victor's lawyer had stopped reading. He was looking at Charlotte now instead, and his expression was the expression of a man rapidly revising his understanding of how the next few hours were going to go. "These are allegations," Victor said. "They'll be answered in court with evidence and—" "We have the evidence," Charlotte said. "That's what I'm telling you. You have documents from men whose credibility—" "We have documents," Haddocks said, looking up for the first time, "from a former employee of the Eastern Interests firm who came forward voluntarily, and physical financial records that were subpoenaed through the Federal Circuit 2 weeks ago." He looked at Victor with those pale gray eyes. "Not from Roy's people, from the Federal Circuit." A beat. "We've been building this for 8 months, Mr. Blackwood. Your timing in acquiring Miss Hayes's father's debt was what brought you to our attention in the first place." The room stopped moving. Victor Blackwood, for the first time in William Carter's experience of the man, had nothing to say. His lawyer put his hand on Victor's arm and leaned close and said something in a low voice. Victor didn't appear to hear it. He was looking at Charlotte, and something in his face had changed the architecture of certainty that had been there since the station platform, since before that, since decades of getting what he wanted from a world that had organized itself to accommodate his wanting. That architecture was cracking. Slowly. Visibly. Like ice in April. 8 months, Victor said, very quietly. "You've been building a case," Haddocks said. "Yes, sir. Miss Hayes's arrival in Wyoming was honestly a fortunate development for our timeline. Her father's records provided the Eastern connection we needed to tie the Wyoming transactions to a broader pattern." He gathered his papers. "I'll be serving notice at your property this afternoon regarding the herd inspection. I'd recommend having your ranch manager available." Victor's lawyer was speaking urgently again. Victor still wasn't listening. I was looking at Charlotte. And William watched it happen, the moment a man like Victor Blackwood confronted the gap between what he'd believed he was doing and what he'd actually done. The stories powerful men tell themselves are the ones they believe most completely, and the hardest moment is not getting caught. The hardest moment is looking at the person you hurt and having them look back at you with clear eyes and name it plainly. Charlotte did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She just looked at him like a woman who had carried a truth a long way and had finally set it down in the right place. "My father was a good man," she said. "He would have paid his debts. He paid every debt he could. He just couldn't pay one that was designed to be unpayable." She paused. "You knew that. When you set the terms, you knew that." Victor said nothing. "I don't want your apology," Charlotte said. "I don't want anything from you. I just wanted someone in authority to know what you did." She looked at Haddix, then back at Victor. "Now they do." She turned around and walked to the door. William looked at Victor Blackwood one more time. The man was 60 years old and powerful, and had for the first time in probably decades been in a room where power didn't bend to accommodate him. "The creek flows through Carterland," William said. "It's going to keep flowing through Carterland." He put his hat on. "Good morning, Victor." He walked out. Charlotte was on the courthouse steps in the November air, and she was shaking very slightly. The fine, controlled tremor of a person who has held something together at considerable effort and is now allowing themselves just barely the acknowledgement of how much it cost. William came and stood beside her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then, no. Then, both, I think." He didn't say anything. He just stood there beside her, which was enough, which was what she needed without either of them having to name it. Roy came out behind them and stood on her other side. After a moment, he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, one solid certain touch, and then took it away. "Your father would have liked this," Roy said. "He would have liked all of this." Charlotte pressed her lips together hard for a second. Then she nodded. The street of Dust Creek was watching them from various windows and doorways. William let it watch. Let it see 3 people standing on the courthouse steps in the cold, and whatever conclusions it drew from that, let it draw them. The hearing was set for 1 week later, 1 week during which Victor Blackwood's lawyers filed 3 separate motions, and Haddix's deputies denied all 3, during which the county sheriff Pruitt was quietly told by Haddix that his cooperation would be noted in the federal report, after which Pruitt became considerably more cooperative, during which Gideon Walsh from the general store sent a note to the ranch saying he could fill the Carter supply order after all, which William noted without commenting on. The herd inspection happened on the 3rd day. Haddix and both deputies rode to Blackwood's North Range with a federal warrant, and 3 hours later they came back with confirmation that 6 steers bearing William's brand were in that herd. Rebrand attempted but incomplete, the original marks still legible under the new ones, to anyone who knew what to look for. William got the news at the kitchen table and sat with it for a moment. "How was Sloppy?" Charlotte said. "He moved too fast. He didn't give the brand change enough time because he thought he was going to close this before it mattered." "Because he thought I'd sell," William said. "Because he always wins," she said. "People who always win start to think winning is the natural state. They stop being careful." She was quiet. "That's the only thing arrogance is ever good for. It makes people sloppy." William looked at her across the table. "You've been thinking about this since before you got off that train," he said. Not an accusation, just the recognition of a pattern finally become clear. Charlotte met his eyes. "I've been thinking about my father for 3 months," she said. "About how it happened. About what I could have done differently. About whether there was any version of events where he didn't lose everything." She paused. When he told me what he had, I knew I couldn't change what happened to my father. But I thought maybe I could make sure it didn't happen to someone else." She looked at the table. "I wasn't sure there was a someone else until I got here," she said quietly. "I thought maybe it would be a stranger, a transaction. I'd help, and then—" She stopped. "And then," William said. "And then I'd figure out what came after," she said. "I hadn't figured that part out yet." The kitchen was quiet in the particular way of a room holding a conversation that both people know is about more than its surface. "Have you figured it out now?" William asked. She looked up at him. "I think I have," she said. Just that. Just those 4 words, and the way she said them, which was neither bold nor shy, but simply true, the way she said every true thing. William Carter had not said certain things to a woman in 4 years. Not because he didn't feel them. He'd been losing that argument with himself for weeks, but because saying them meant something. It meant a door was open. And doors that were open could let things in, and doors that were open could let things out. And the last time he'd had a door fully open, the winter had come through it and taken everything. But Charlotte Hayes had stood on his porch with a shotgun and walked his creek in his boots and argued federal riparian law with a banker and gone to face a courthouse full of power with nothing but the truth and her father's paperwork, and the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't know it's courage, it just knows it's necessary. He was not going to let that leave. He was not going to stand on another platform and watch something irreplaceable go. "Charlotte," he said. "Yes," she said. She said it before he'd said anything else, and maybe it was just acknowledgement, but it didn't sound like just acknowledgement. "I don't want you to figure out what comes after somewhere that isn't here," he said. She was very still. "William, I know this isn't—" He stopped, started again. "I know the way this started. I know I had $10 in my pocket to send you home, and I know you've had more reasons to leave than to stay, and I know I am not an easy man." He looked at her directly the way she always looked at him, no deflection, no careful management of distance. "But I think you already know that I—" He stopped again, and something in his face was both more open and more unguarded than she'd ever seen it. "I think you know." She looked at him. "I know," she said, soft, completely certain. "Then I'd like—" He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and he said, "I'd like you to stay." "Yes," she said. Not as, "I know what you mean," she said. "Yes." He held her hand, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was steady, and outside, the Wyoming wind was doing what Wyoming wind does, and inside Carter Ranch, something that had been broken for a long time, found quietly, and without ceremony, that it was not broken anymore. The hearing was held in the Dust Creek Courthouse on a Thursday morning, and it was everything Victor Blackwood had believed would never happen to him. The room was fuller than William had expected. Word had moved through the territory as it does in places where people live close enough to the ground to feel the vibrations. The Pattersons had come, the family from the South Range, who'd sold their property 3 years ago, at a loss they'd never understood. Thomas Erickson was there, older than William remembered, sitting near the back with his hat in his hands. There were others William recognized only by association, by the quiet historical fact of their losses. They had come to see. Haddix ran the proceeding with the economy of a man who has marshaled many hearings and knows exactly how much theater they require and how much they don't. Victor's lawyer made his arguments well constructed, technically sophisticated, the arguments of a good lawyer who has a bad case. Haddix's presentation was documentary. Here is the deed. Here is the survey. Here is the discrepancy. Here is the financial record. Here is the Federal Circuit's confirmation. Victor sat at the opposing table in his clean white hat, and for the first hour he sat, the way he always sat, with the composed authority of a man whose position is unassailable. By the second hour, the hat was on the table in front of him. The moment that William would remember, the moment that the room remembered, that people talked about in Dust Creek for years afterward, came when Charlotte took the stand. Haddix had asked her to speak. Not about the ranch, not about the creek. Roy's documents and the financial records covered those. He asked her to speak about her father. She sat in the witness chair, and she told it plainly. No drama, no performance. Just the facts of a family, a business, a debt that arrived like a weapon disguised as a letter. The 60-day notice. The bank that wouldn't refinance. The house that went first, and then everything else. Her father's face when he understood what was happening and couldn't stop it. He died thinking he'd failed us, she said. Her voice was steady. He died believing he hadn't been careful enough, hadn't been smart enough, hadn't protected his family well enough. And none of that was true. She looked at the marshal, not at Victor. He was careful. He was smart. He loved us, and he worked his whole life, and he was deliberately, systematically ruined by a man with enough money to make it look like bad luck. She paused. I want that on the record. My father did not fail. He was failed. The room was completely silent. Then William stood up. Nobody had asked him to. It wasn't a planned part of the proceeding. Haddix looked at him with a question in those gray eyes, and William looked back and said, I need to say something. Haddix considered him for a moment. Go ahead, Mr. Carter, he said. William had not prepared remarks because he was not a man who prepared remarks. He stood up in front of the courthouse full of people who had watched him struggle for 4 years, and had mostly concluded he was finished, and he said what was true. "She came here on a train," he said. "I went to that station to tell her to go back. I had $10 in my pocket for her return ticket. I thought I knew what she was, what the situation was, and I thought I knew what I needed, which was nothing and no one." He stopped. I was wrong. He looked at Charlotte, who was looking at him from the witness chair with wide, careful eyes. "She didn't come here to be rescued. She didn't need me to take care of her. She came here with her father's memory and his accounts and the knowledge of what had been done to him, and she walked into the worst situation this ranch has ever been in, and she made it better." He looked back at the room. "She showed me what I'd been doing wrong with the cattle. She found the water problem. She organized the records. She wrote the letters. She stood on that porch last week with a shotgun when Victor's men came at night." He paused. "Everything I have left is because of what she did in 4 weeks." He looked at Charlotte. "I said before that she made me a better rancher," he said. "That's true, but it's not the whole truth." He held her eyes. "The whole truth is that she came off that train and she didn't leave, and for the first time in 4 years, I had a reason to think this place was worth saving." He paused. "For the first time in 4 years, I had a reason to think I was." Charlotte's eyes were bright. She didn't look away. Haddock's was quiet for a moment after William sat down. Then he said with the faintest possible trace of something that was almost warmth, "Thank you, Mr. Carter. That'll be in the record." Victor Blackwood had not moved during this. He was looking at the table in front of him, and his hands were flat on the surface, and something in the set of his shoulders had changed in a way that was not quite defeat, but was the thing that comes just before it, the giving up of the last position, the acknowledgement that the ground you've been standing on is not as solid as you believed. His lawyer leaned over and spoke quietly to him. Victor picked up his hat. He put it back on. He looked up, and for one moment, his eyes went to Charlotte, and then to William, and what passed across his face in that moment was too complicated and too private to name. Then he looked straight forward, and he listened to the rest of the proceeding in silence. Haddock issued his findings at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Victor Blackwood was formally charged with federal wire fraud, property interference, and theft of livestock. The county survey that had supported the creek diversion claim was found to be fabricated, and the surveyor's license was referred for revocation. A federal receiver was appointed to oversee Victor's accounts pending investigation of the broader pattern of debt acquisition. The 6 steers were to be returned to Carter Ranch within 48 hours. The bank was formally notified of the federal findings, which had the effect, which Haddock had clearly anticipated, and Charlotte had clearly understood, was coming of completely renegotiating the terms of William's loan, since the bank's pressure on that loan was now subject to examination as part of the broader pattern. Horace Elgin, sitting in the back of the room with his hands in his lap, looked at the floor when this was read out, and then looked at William with the expression of a man who is going to have a very difficult internal conversation on the drive home. When it was over, the room began to empty, and William found himself surrounded by people he'd known for years who were saying things he hadn't heard in a long time. The Patterson family. Thomas Erickson, old neighbors who'd watched and said nothing, and who were now in the way of communities that have been collectively holding a difficult breath, beginning slowly to let it out. He shook hands. He accepted words he didn't have responses to. He was looking through all of it for Charlotte. She was standing near the door with Roy, and she was listening to something Roy was saying, and she had one hand pressed flat against her collarbone in a gesture he'd seen from her before. When something was too large to process quickly, she held it there like she was keeping it from moving too fast. She looked up and found him looking at her through the crowd. She lowered her hand. She smiled, the real one, the one that wasn't rueful or small, but full and unguarded, the smile of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just finally set it down. William moved through the crowd. Roy stepped back without being asked, the way a man does when he reads a situation correctly. William stood in front of her. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He reached up and brushed a strand of yellow hair back from her face. Such a simple gesture, such an ordinary gesture, the kind of thing done between people who have known each other a long time and take the right to it for granted. And she leaned into it, the smallest and most complete motion, like something that had been waiting to happen for weeks, had finally found its moment. Outside the courthouse, Dust Creek went about its afternoon. Inside, William Carter held Charlotte Hayes's face in his hands and said quietly, for the second and final time, "Stay." "I'm already staying," she said. And that was that. The 6 steers came back on a Friday. 2 of Haddock's deputies rode them in from the Blackwood North Range, and William was at the gate when they arrived, and he counted all 6 without saying a word, and then he put them back in the south pasture where they belonged and latched the gate himself. He stood there with his hand on the latch for a moment, just a moment, and then he walked back to the house. Charlotte was on the porch. She'd seen the whole thing from there. She didn't say anything when he came up the steps. She just handed him a cup of coffee, and he took it, and they stood there together, watching the south pasture, the way you watch something you nearly lost and have just gotten back, which is differently from how you watched it before. More carefully, with the particular gratitude of people who have learned that things are not permanent simply because they are yours. 6, she said. 6, he said. She nodded once to herself and went back inside. He stood on the porch a moment longer. The Wyoming morning was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and cold, in a way that was clarifying rather than punishing. And William Carter stood in it and felt something he hadn't felt in so long that it took him a moment to recognize it. He felt like the ground under his feet was his, not just legally, not just on paper, not just in the way that a deed says a thing belongs to you, while the bank and the neighbors and the slow erosion of hard years quietly disagree. He felt it the way his father must have felt it when he first broke this ground as fact, as permanence, as something worth the difficulty of keeping. He went inside. Charlotte was at the table with the ranch accounts, which was where she always was in the morning, and she looked up when he came in and read whatever was on his face, with the ease of a woman who had learned a man's face, the way she'd learned everything else carefully, completely, without making a performance of the knowing. "You all right?" she said. "Yes," he said. And then, because it was true, and because he was trying lately to say the true things instead of the managed versions, better than all right. She held his gaze for a moment, and then went back to the accounts, and he sat down across from her and picked up his own work, and the morning went on around them both. That was December. January was hard. The way Wyoming. Januaries are always hard. A fact of weather and cold, and the relentless physical demand of keeping animals alive in temperatures that do not care whether you are tired. William and Charlotte worked it side by side, which had become the natural order of things at Carter Ranch, with a speed that would have surprised him in November, and surprised him not at all by January. She knew his rhythm. He knew hers. They moved around the work and around each other with the efficiency of 2 people who have stopped negotiating the space between them because they've settled into a shared one. Margaret came in January. She arrived unannounced because that was Margaret's way, and because she'd been waiting. William understood this to see it for herself, rather than trust the letters. She drove up in a hired wagon from the Laramie stage, and stood in the yard, and looked at the ranch with the expression of a woman who has spent 4 years being afraid for her brother, and is now carefully deciding whether she is allowed to stop. William came out to meet her. She looked at him for a long moment. "You look different," she said. "I'm not different," he said. "You look like yourself," she said. "The way you used to." He didn't have an answer for that. He picked up her bag and said, "Come inside. Charlotte made something." Margaret stopped walking. Charlotte made. She looked at him with eyes that were doing too much at once, fond and tearful and triumphant and apologetic all together. "William Carter." "Margaret," he said. "Don't. I'm not doing anything. You're about to say something that's going to embarrass both of us." "I was only going to say I'm glad," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly. "I'm just glad." He put his arm around her shoulders briefly, which was more than he would have done a year ago, and walked her inside. Charlotte was at the stove. She turned when they came in, and Margaret looked at her, this woman she had chosen sight unseen through an advertisement, and sent on a train across 1,000 miles, on the strength of a feeling and a hope. And Charlotte looked back at her with those steady, clear eyes, and Margaret said before she could stop herself, "Oh, thank God." Charlotte's face broke into a real laugh, surprised and warm and full, the kind of laugh that changes a room. "I hope that's a compliment," she said. "It is the highest one I have," Margaret said. They embraced, and William stood in the doorway of his own kitchen, watching his sister and the woman he intended to marry hold each other like old friends, and he thought that grief does a particular thing to time. It stretches the bad parts until they feel like they are all there is, until you forget that the calendar keeps moving. Regardless that seasons change, that there are mornings on the other side of the longest night. He'd forgotten that. He'd needed someone to walk through his door and remind him that the calendar had not in fact stopped. I was grateful in a way that had no adequate language. So he didn't try to find one. He just went and sat at the table and let the kitchen be full of sound and warmth and other people, and he thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. This is what I forgot. Margaret stayed for 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks, she had a conversation with Charlotte that William was not present for. They were together in the kitchen one evening while he was in the barn, and he didn't ask what they'd said, and neither woman offered it. But something shifted between them after that, a warmth that had been friendly becoming something more like family. He noticed it the way you notice things at Carter Ranch, which was by the evidence rather than the declaration. On the morning Margaret left, she pulled William aside at the gate. "She told me about her father," Margaret said. William nodded. He'd known that was part of what they'd talked about. "She misses him," Margaret said. "She carries it quietly, but she misses him a lot." She looked at her brother. "She needs a family, William, not just a partnership, not just a practical arrangement." A pause. "She's not going to ask for it. She doesn't ask for things. You know that about her." "I know that," he said. "So don't make her wait too long," Margaret said. He drove her to the stage stop and came back, and Charlotte was in the barn with the heifer, who had long since recovered from the stone in her hoof, but who Charlotte had developed a particular fondness for and checked on daily, for reasons she didn't explain and William didn't question. He stood in the barn doorway. "Margaret likes you," he said. Charlotte looked over her shoulder at him. "I like her," she said. "She's the most straightforward person I've ever met." "She said the same about you." Charlotte turned back to the heifer. She was quiet for a moment. "She loves you very much," she said. "She spent 4 years being afraid you'd disappear into this ranch and never come back out." A pause. "I understand why she was afraid." "I'm not disappearing," William said. "No," Charlotte agreed. "You're not." She sounded certain about this in the way she was certain about things she'd decided rather than things she hoped. He walked into the barn. He came up beside her. She straightened and turned to face him, and he was close enough that she had to look up slightly, which she did without stepping back. "Charlotte Hayes," he said. She heard something in the way he said her name and went very still. "I have nothing elaborate to offer you," he said. "You know exactly what this ranch is and what it isn't. You know what I am and what I'm working on being." He held her eyes. "I know you didn't come here for this. I know you came here for something else entirely, and this happened alongside it. But it happened." He paused. "I would like it to keep happening, formally, with a name for it." She was looking at him with an expression he had seen before, but not this purely the expression that was underneath all the steadiness, the one she didn't usually let out to the surface. Something bright and careful and completely unguarded. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said, quietly. "Yes," he said. "I'm asking you to marry me." She was quiet for a moment. That was not long, but felt considered, not hesitation. He understood, but the weighing of something she wanted to be sure she held correctly. "Yes," she said. "I am saying yes." He reached out and took her face in his hands, the same gesture from the courthouse, the one that had felt like the first honest thing he'd done in 4 years, and she put her hands over his, and they stood there in the barn, in the January cold, and it was not romantic in any storybook sense. It was better than that. It was real. The heifer regarded them both with the profound disinterest of a cow who has better things to think about. They were married in April, which was Charlotte's idea, and which was right for the reasons she gave. The ranch was past its worst and moving toward its best. The hard winter was behind them. The South pasture steers had sold at nearly double the November price, exactly as she'd calculated, and the bank had restructured the loan on terms that were, if not generous, at least survivable. April felt like the correct time. Things opening up. The land saying yes. Roy came. Dell and Peso came. Haddix sent a letter that Charlotte read twice and put away carefully in the tin box with the deed. Horace Elgin from the bank came, which surprised William more than anything else, and Horace shook his hand with the expression of a man who has done some reckoning with himself over the winter and is trying quietly and without announcement to be different going forward. William shook his hand back without commentary. That was enough. The Pattersons came. Thomas Erickson came. People William hadn't seen since those families had left the territory, who had heard through the particular long-distance telegraph of community that runs on letters and word of mouth and the deep human need to know how things turn out. Some of them had come back just for this, just to stand in a field in Wyoming in April and watch a man who'd been losing become a man who'd found his footing. Margaret stood at the front with tears running freely down her face, which she did not attempt to stop because Margaret had never seen the point of pretending not to feel things. William and Charlotte stood under the old cottonwood at the edge of the east field. Charlotte's choice, because she'd walked out there one afternoon in February and said simply there, and he'd understood immediately, and they said what needed to be said in front of everyone who needed to hear it. The minister asked William if he took this woman, and he said yes, and the minister asked Charlotte if she took this man, and she said yes, and then the minister said a few other things that were appropriate to the occasion. But what William remembered afterward was not the words of the ceremony. What he remembered was the way Charlotte looked at him during it, not with the careful, measured gaze he'd learned to read over 4 months of mornings and difficult evenings and long nights at the kitchen table, but with something different underneath that, something she'd kept below the surface and was now here in front of everyone letting be visible. She was happy. Not managed happy. Not resolved happy. Not the happiness of a person who has made the best of a situation. Actually fully, unreservedly happy in the way of a person who had stopped expecting to be and found it anyway in the least expected place. He thought, I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure she keeps that look. He thought I was going to send her home with $10. He thought, thank God she pushed my hand away. He put the ring on her finger, and she put one on his, and then she looked up at him and said very quietly, so only he could hear, "You're not alone anymore, William." And he said, "Neither are you." The reception was in the yard, which meant it was Wyoming in April, which meant it was cold enough for coats and nobody cared. Roy produced whiskey from somewhere. Margaret organized the food with the efficiency of a woman who has been planning something for longer than the occasion would suggest. Dell and Peso stood near the fence with cups in their hands and the slightly dazed expressions of men who don't attend many weddings and are finding it unexpectedly affecting. Gideon Walsh from the general store came and shook William's hand and said without preamble or explanation, "I should have stood up sooner." William looked at him and said, "You're here now," because that was the honest accounting and the most useful one. Gideon nodded and went to find food, and that conversation was finished. Thomas Erickson found Charlotte near the cottonwood tree an hour into the afternoon, and they talked for 20 minutes, and William watched from a distance without going over, because some conversations are not for witnesses. He saw Charlotte's face go through several things during it, and he saw Thomas's face go through several things, and at the end, Thomas took both of her hands and held them for a moment, and then walked away, and Charlotte stood there for a bit, looking at the field before she came back to where William was standing. "He's thinking about coming back," she said. "He has family in Colorado, but he never stopped thinking of this as home." She paused. "He said if the territory changes enough, there might be a reason." "Tell him it's changed," William said. She looked at him. "Tell him it's changed," William said again. "Because it has, and it's going to keep changing." She found Thomas before he left and told him, and Thomas shook William's hand again on his way out with an expression that was something like the first look at a door that had been closed for a long time, finding itself possibly not completely shut. That was the wedding. A year after Charlotte Hayes had stepped off the train at Dust Creek Station, William Carter stood at the north fence line of Carter Ranch in the early morning and looked at what they had built. The south pasture was full. The creek ran clear, and on the right side of the property line, Federally confirmed, documented in triplicate, not going anywhere. The barn had a new door he'd built himself over 2 weekends in February, with Charlotte handing him boards and telling him when he had the angle wrong, which was twice. The garden beds on the south side of the house were Charlotte's domain, and she had done things with them that William wouldn't have believed possible in Wyoming soil, because she'd spent 3 months researching what grew in this climate and then simply grown it. The books were balanced. Not generously. This was still a working ranch, and working ranches do not apologize for what they are, but honestly and sustainably, and with a clear line between where they were and where they were going. Charlotte had shown him that line the way she showed him everything, by putting it on paper, pointing to it, and making it impossible to look away from. Victor Blackwood's federal case was proceeding in Laramie slow and thorough, the way federal cases go. His land holdings were under a receiver's supervision. The power he'd carried through Dust Creek for 20 years had not disappeared overnight. These things never do, but it had fractured, and the pieces of it were falling in different directions, and the spaces those pieces left were being filled by other things. By the Erickson family, who had come back in March and were rebuilding on their old property. By new people who arrived and found a county that was becoming something different from what it had been. By small decisions made by individual people to do things differently than before. William thought about what Charlotte had said on the walk home from the creek that first night when they'd fixed the diversion in the dark. He's scared of what you could become. He hadn't believed her then. He'd thought it was the kind of thing people said to encourage the discouraged, the polite, useful fiction of hope. He believed her now. He walked back to the house. Charlotte was in the kitchen, which was where she always was in the morning, except that now she was not alone at the table. Margaret had come for another visit, and the two of them were talking with the ease of people who have decided they are family and are now simply behaving accordingly. They looked up when he came in. "There's coffee," Charlotte said. "I can see that," he said, and poured himself a cup. "Roy sent a letter," Charlotte said, pushing it across the table. "He and the others are wintering in Arizona. He says to tell you the whiskey at our wedding was the best he's had in 3 states. "He brought the whiskey himself," William said. "I know," Charlotte said. "I think that's the point." He sat down. Margaret was looking between them with the expression she'd started wearing when she visited something so deeply satisfied. It was almost smug, the expression of a woman who made a very difficult call and turned out to be absolutely right and has the grace not to say so more than about once a week. "Don't," William said. "I'm not doing anything," Margaret said. "You're doing the face." "I don't have a face." "Margaret, I'm just sitting here," she said, "drinking coffee, in my brother's kitchen, with his wife." She smiled. "I'm very happy, that's all." Charlotte was trying not to laugh. William looked at her, and she gave up trying and laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, the way it always did, warm and real and completely without performance. And William drank his coffee and listened to his sister and his wife talk, and the morning went on, and the ranch went on, and the world outside kept doing what the world does. Later that afternoon, a young man from the neighboring property, 19 years old, son of a family that had come from Ohio the previous fall, still figuring out what he was doing and what this land was, and how a person made a life in a place this large and indifferent, came to the fence line and asked William, with the careful embarrassment of the young asking advice of the less young, how you kept something going when everything seemed to be working against it. William thought about the question. He thought about 4 years alone and $10 in a coat pocket. He thought about a broken suitcase clasp tied shut with rope. He thought about Charlotte walking his creek in his boots and arguing federal law with a banker and standing on a porch with a shotgun and saying, "I'm already staying," in a voice that had no doubt in it whatsoever. He thought about what he'd said at the courthouse, which had come out of him without planning, which meant it was the thing he actually believed. For the first time in 4 years, I had a reason to think this place was worth saving. For the first time in 4 years, I had a reason to think I was. He looked at the young man. "The land needs tending," he said. "Every day. You don't get to take a day off from it." He paused. "But that's not actually the hard part. The hard part is thinking you can do it alone. The hard part is deciding you'd rather go empty than risk something being taken from you again." He looked at the fence line at the property running south toward the creek He could hear from here if he was quiet. Whatever you're trying to keep alive ranch business, anything you cannot do it alone. And I don't mean you need hired hands. He looked back at the young man. I mean you need people who will stand on your porch when they didn't have to. Who will walk into a courthouse with you. Who will push your hand away when you offer them the money to leave. The young man looked at him, processing this. How do you find those people? He asked. William thought about that. You don't close the door before they can knock, he said. The young man nodded slowly with the expression of someone who is young enough that wisdom is still new enough to recognize itself when it arrives. He thanked William and went back to his own side of the fence, and William stood there watching him go and thinking about doors. He'd kept his closed for 4 years. He'd kept it closed against grief and against risk and against the particular terror of needing someone again. He'd thought the closed door was protection. He'd thought empty was safe. He'd been wrong about what safety was. Safety was not the absence of risk. Safety was standing in the kitchen when someone came home. Safety was a hand turned over on a table. Safety was someone who learned your face and read it true and stayed anyway. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they chose to. Charlotte had chosen him on that platform before she knew anything about him, had decided somewhere between stepping off that train and setting her chin against Victor Blackwood's cruelty that she was going to face whatever came next, with her face forward, and she was not going to do it by running. He had $10 in his pocket to send her home. She had pushed his hand away. That was the whole story, really. Everything else was what happened because of those two things, her refusal to leave and his slow, grudging, absolute inability to want her to. He turned and walked back to the house. Charlotte was on the porch now, having come out at some point while he was at the fence, and she was watching him come across the yard with those steady, clear eyes that had been reading him true since November. She had a shawl over her shoulders, and her yellow hair was loose the way she wore it on days when there was no particular reason to have it otherwise, and she was leaning on the porch rail he had finally fixed in February, and she was home. She was home because she had decided to be, and that decision freely made by a woman who had been given every reason to make a different one, was the thing William Carter understood now to be the most valuable thing on Carter Ranch, worth more than water rights and spring cattle prices and federal court victories, worth more than everything Victor Blackwood had spent years trying to acquire by dismantling other people. You couldn't buy it. You couldn't deed it. You could only be worthy of it day by day, the way you are worthy of good land by showing up and doing the work and not taking it for granted. William Carter came up the porch steps. Charlotte looked at him. "How's the fence line?" she said. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. He took her hand. She held it. And Carter Ranch, the soil and the creek and the heifer, and the south pasture steers, and the garden beds, and the kitchen with its morning coffee, and the east bedroom that had been hers first and was now theirs, and the deed in the tin box under the study floor, and the two people who had decided against every reasonable expectation to make something here went on. Not perfectly, not easily, but truly and together and for a very long time. That was enough. That had always been enough. That was in fact everything.